could be so cool.
As rumor has it still, I followed the rules of Frank Abagnale. So catch me if you can, ain't peep me when I take off, check me when I land. White collar mischief, never been caught. So if money's on your mind, nigga, hold that thought. Daydreaming of a meal, but plotting the same fortune. I think make it rain, or maybe I'm brainstorming. Young, getting busy on his own like an orphan. My city slicker ways equal self-made endorsements. Damn, it's a commodity. You were such a lottery ticket, making these rappers seem sorry. Apologies. Somebody gotta do it. I guess it's gonna be moi. I'm in a foreign Maserati, please say a why. Yeah, life's a bitch, money made it up. Every now and then I like to cheat on her with lady luck.
Push come to shove,
Come to shove,
push back,
push back.
tell him you ain't going out like that. When push come to shove,
Come to shove,
push back,
push back.
you ain't gotta take that, homie, homie, get down,
Get down, get down, get down,
get down, homie, homie, get down,
get down, feet on pavement, grind time blisters. Entertaining the idea that I can get richer. Corrupt moves, can't explain it all like Clarissa, but it's a reason for my motives I deliver. Gucci bag straps is becoming my enigma. I'm too old for swag, I'm focused on my charisma. Saying, yo, why you talking like them white folks? I say I'm just shaking hands with the right folks. Clocking overtime with the same clothes. What time you off work? When the bank closed. I dated females with issues that I'm the blame for, or falling victim to the emotions I ain't show. Close knitted to the cloth of success. Some call it being confident, I call it being blessed. Just a minute, let me get it off my chest. See, I'm coming for what's next. Y'all niggas can have a rest. Wait,
push come to shove,
come to shove,
push back,
push back.
tell him you ain't going out like that. When push come to shove,
Come to shove,
push back,
push back.
you ain't gotta take that, homie, homie.